This is the Mainstays Santoku, another very inexpensive kitchen knife. I've used this for around 3 weeks with the initial edge. At that point, it had dulled enough so that it couldn't anymore slice fresh breads, slice tomatoes, cut green onions, that type of work. Of course, it can still cut stiffer fruits, stiffer vegetables, but again, on anything that requires a high sharpness, problematic. That isn't, however, an indication of the steel or the heat treatment. This knife came with a low to moderate push cutting sharpness and almost non-existent slicing aggression. Checking the edge under magnification, again you can clearly see what's symptomatic of this type of edge. The edge bevel that you can see is formed by a belt sander usually, and then it's strapped or buffed using a wheel or similar another belt. That's too soft. The edge both gets rounded and it gets overheated. Thus it comes with no slicing aggression, and because it was overheated, it also has very low durability and low edge retention. Just to confirm that hypothesis, the edge was resharpened, left with the finish of a very coarse, cheap bench stone. Then it was used to carve pine, 500 cuts into the pine, and it could still very easily slice newsprint. And that was again with a very low grit finish, which is worst case scenario. So no real problems with the steel or heat treatment, but the initial edge not very sharp, and the initial edge retention quite poor, among the worst seen so far. Now, bypassing that is just a matter of sharpening the edge. The edge grinds very well. A couple of passes initially showed that this area was around 15 degrees per side. This area was much higher. This was around 15 degrees per side, and up by the tip again much higher. So I switched over to a 100 grit Japanese water stone, which has a very nice fast cutting ability. And very quickly, around 50 passes per side, the entire edge was ground down to an even 15 degrees per side. I then brought it up to a 3000 grit water stone in one jump, just to see how the steel responded when you don't use ideal technique or ideal equipment, because of course you shouldn't jump that high, but the grindability of this steel is very high and it responded very quickly. So within just a minute or so on the stone, the polish started to come up and it started to push cut into newspaper, and only a couple of minutes beyond that and it was basically at the finish of a 3000 grit stone. So it sharpens very well, very high grindability, no significant issues with burr formation. Now, a couple of issues about grip ergonomics. Works very well in general. It's contoured both in width as well as in thickness. It has a relatively large handle. I mean, I can easily grip it and it still protrudes on both ends. So you'd need to have a monstrous size hand for this not to be comfortable. The spine isn't fully rounded, but the edges are broken, and the coating on the spine again rounds it out a bit more. So no issues with discomfort. It's not squarish for using your thumb on the spine or even doing heel strikes or presses for harder cuts. There are a couple of issues with ergonomics. One of the main ones is the front of the handle is left relatively squarish. So in pinch grips, when you're working up on the blade, you are gripping over a relatively squarish section. And this area, the heel of the blade and intersection of the handle, also doesn't flow together very well. So using a grip like that puts a relatively high pressure point right there on your index finger. Two relatively minor issues, but if you're again using pinch grips or forward grips, you will sort of feel the effect in terms of comfort. In general, a couple of other issues with grip. It's a relatively soft handle material, becoming more and more common on kitchen knives now because people are starting to want comfort and extended use, so this is a bit soft. This again does give a nice feel, does give nice comfort. However, it's not very cut or abrasion resistant. You can see a couple of scratches in it, and this blue coloring that's on it is just that. It's just the top layer. As soon as you cut it or scratch it, you can see the much darker color underneath. It has very low heat resistance. Exposure to an open flame, immediately it starts to bubble and it starts to smoke and discolor. However, it does clean relatively easy. There's no crevices, there's no cracks. Of course, it's just a molded on grip, so everything wipes off. However, in that note, there is a gap between the handle and the blade right here and gaps on the side. So liquids do get down into that, so you want to take some care. Of course, these can be filled if you have a syringe, and you can inject epoxy in it and then sand these down. But again, this is a very inexpensive knife. People are not most likely to put any work into that. In terms of general use, this is more of a utility style Santoku than a chef style Santoku. So, for example, it doesn't have the blade width for nice chopping or push cutting motions because your hand is actually, your fingers are actually below the blade. You don't have that nice clearance. However, for peeling apples, peeling potatoes, it's much more useful than a full width Santoku, which is more of a chef's knife. So I have been using mainly Santoku's and large chef's knife in the kitchen review series for a while now. So switching up to this, which is more utility style, was a nice break and allowed me to look at knives from another perspective. And all the utility style work, again, I found to be of course much easier with the much more narrow blade, much smaller blade, much lighter blade. But all the chopping, all the dicing, the mincing, the paring was now more difficult. The other issue which makes this or reduces the performance, you don't have a nice smooth continuous arc with this knife. What you have is a section of flats. This section right here is relatively flat, this is relatively flat, and this is relatively flat. So if you try to do rocking cuts, you don't get that nice continuous shear motion that you would get on, say, green onions or dices. You just get big flat sections. So again, rocking motions do not tend to work very well. You need to do more straight up and down sort of dicing. That can be fixed, but it's a lot of work. You essentially have to take a very coarse stone and sort of create an arc in the blade. Many people have taken extended bellies out, which is relatively easy. You just flatten it. But to put one in requires a lot of work, and again, this is a very inexpensive knife. But if I was using this long term, that's one of the modifications I would make. Change this from 3 flats to a nice smooth arc by bringing the curvature down here, bringing it down here. One thing which was nice to see on this knife, it actually does have a point. While that may sound a bit silly, a lot of the inexpensive knives, the bevels do not meet very clearly on top, and they're also rounded or usually squared off because of just sort of poor control. But this one has a very nice sharp point, so using it to do scoring type cuts works very well. Penetrating food packages to open them, getting in between sort of frozen foods and prying them apart, again, works relatively well. And this knife again is more on the durability side. You can see there's no distal taper. The thickness is taken all the straight way out from the spine, held right through the tip. And the other thing, of course, is it has basically flat sections right here and a relatively short primary grind and a moderate edge angle and a moderate edge thickness. So it's not completely as far towards optimized for light cutting ability as some of the other knives that I've been using. So you can do heavier work with it. You can rock through, say, the bones between a chicken leg and a chicken thigh without being that concerned about the edge taking any damage, because you've got a lot more metal here than some of the other knives that I've used, which go as low as, say, 10 degrees per side and around 10 thousandths at the edge. This one's significantly heavier. And again, there's more actual numbers and stuff in the description below. The other thing I found, which was actually quite nice, the blade coating on this, which is advertised as non-stick, actually is a non-stick type coating. It isn't 100%, and if you compare this to some of the other knives that I've shown, which do cut through potatoes 100% smooth and doesn't have any sticking at all, this one is not quite there. But comparing this to a blade of similar sort of style, and this has the worst geometry for sticking. It has flat sides and sort of a very short hollow bevel, so you will get sticking right along these flats. This sticks much less than a similar style knife without the coating, so the coating is functional. It's also relatively durable. There are a couple of scratches on the coating here, which I have no idea how they formed. They were there one day, and I have no memory of cutting anything abrasive. but they were the only scratches. And all the vegetables I buy are normally fresh from the garden. I don't extensively wash them before I peel them and that type of stuff. So the coating is relatively durable. It hasn't been exposed to a dishwasher, so I don't know how it reacts to high heat. And again, I'm using this personally, so it's not thrown in a drawer or banged around. If it was, and the same thing, these are hand washed, they're not thrown in a sink. So I would expect that to scratch and ding up the coating relatively easily. So overall, for the first 3 weeks that I've used it, I'm relatively pleased with it, with a few of the exceptions as I've noted. Now the next thing that I will do is check the edge for retention against cardboard alongside some of the other knives that I've got done. And once I'm satisfied with the numbers that I'll get from that, I'll then resharpen it and just use it in the kitchen and see how it works in more extended comparisons against other knives. And finally, when I'm done with that, I'll basically take it and I'll put it in the kitchen and leave it out for friends and family to use. And in that case, it'll be used far more roughly, and I can check and see how it does with various grit finishes on the edge. But that takes quite some time to do. It's about a year to go through all that process. But again, for a relatively inexpensive knife, this worked out relatively well. I got nothing really bad to say about it in that context. One last thing is, there's a whole bunch of different brands of these knives. As I said, this is the Mainstays Santoku. Different people make essentially the same thing. These color-coded blades now, a lot of people are liking them because they use different knives for fruits or vegetables or that kind of thing. And the other thing, if you like different edges, you can put a low grit finish on a blue one, put a high polish on a red one, or personalize them in that respect. And some people just like the colors because they are available in all different colors. I have a blue one and I have an orange one. Both of them came in the same set. So there it is.